Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi everyone. Now we would like to make a presentation for the subjects genres of English literatures. Our material is Introduction to Poetry. We have four members. They are Ernest Edison, Erlangga Saputra, Ihsan Lekrom, and Irzal Ariansa. So next material will be explained by Ernest Edison. So Ernest Edison, time is yours.
Thank you for the moderator for the opportunity for me to talk. First, we would like to talk about the introduction from the book How to Analyze the Poetry. First, we must talk about the purpose of the analysis. Well, analyzing poetry is an activity which has concerned many readers for many years. It is a given assumption that it is worthwhile. And we take that leap of faith because we have found that analyzing poetry is an enjoyable and provocative mental exercise. Basically, we are concerned here with explaining the methods and techniques of taking a poem apart in order to arrive at a greater understanding of both its construction and its meaning. Next, we have apparatus of analysis. Like any apprentice tradesman, those of us who want to analyze poetry skillfully must first become familiar with our tools. Well, actually, we have more than at our disposal than the novice might suspect. In the early chapters of this book, we will survey our tools and then, in the subsequent chapters, carefully apply them to well-known poems. Through the example of the analysis of this poem, it is hoped that one will be able to approach any poem sensibly and then imaginatively arrive at the enlarged understanding of precisely what kind of poem it is, and ultimately whether or not it is to consider a good poem. Well, the name of tools are important before we can talk about irony, didacticism, or paradox. We first need to know precisely what these terms mean. Furthermore, it is essential that we be able to discuss versifications of a poem. That is, what can we say about a poem in a purely mechanism sense? How long are the lines? What kind of rhyme does it exhibit? Etc. And once we have completely familiarized ourselves with the tools, actual analysis will prove much easier than you might think. Well, what is actually analysis look for? Well, many people share a belief in the incorrect notion that analyzing poetry is somehow vague or even far out. Nothing could be further from the truth, for there is a great deal of concrete information to be presented when discussing a poem. Well, granted, one should be imaginative in explaining a poem's possible but less obvious meanings. But first, it is important to be able to tell the reader the most essential facts about the poem. It has a defined mood or atmosphere. It is written from a particular point of view. It can be concrete or abstract, sarcastic or serious, tragic or comic, ironic or literal, and etc. Well, the point is that there are specific things that not only can be said about a poem but even need to be said. It will be useless to begin talking about possibly meanings of a poem, for example, before even acquainting the reader with whether or not the poem rhymes, or even in a simpler sense where it is a long poem or a short poem. In other words, every poem can be analyzed to a certain extent in a completely methodological fashion. To illuminate possible methods is the purpose of this book. It is not designed to transform the reader into an expert critic, but rather to help the students unfamiliar with the poetic analysis towards an appreciation for and in skill in the methods of analysis. Well, that means different forms require different approaches. It is important to realize that there is a large variety of ways in which one can discuss poetry. Different poems or different kinds of poems must be approached in different ways. No one could accurately or usefully analyze, correlate the rhyme of the ancient mariner, while in the same way the one would analyze the frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening. By considering case example of analysis, we will see how to make uh, the methods the method best fit the poem in question. That is, how to decide which key to use for a particular lock. Next will be read by Irzal Aryancha. Time and place will be yours. Thank you.
Thank you for the chance that given to me. First of all, my name is Rizal Aryansha, and I will explain first about form and content. A poem, in other words, will have both a basic structure and a particular experience to relate. Uh, there is a strong, if perhaps not always clearly definable, relationship between content and form, or between subject matter and technique. There are various kinds of poetic forms, which describe not only the whole poem, but its various parts as well. The content of a poem in recent time has come to mean the experience, which the poem crystallis or distillis. Many experiences are basic to the poetry of all time. We think immediately. For example, of the experience of love and death. And then we have diction and versification. The irreducible content of a poem is, of course, the collection of words. Each word in a poem is selected for a particular reason, often because of its various connotation and implication. There must be a resulting suggestivity produced by the words themselves. The way in which the word are arranged the are and meant to rhyme or not to rhyme, for let us dispel at once at the incorrect notion that all poetry rhymes. Leads us to versification, which is the art of metrical composition, the putting together of words to make poems. A poet was originally called maker or maker. Certain repeated patterns of versification create a relationship between one poem and another, and sometimes between poets. If a large number of good poets versify in a similar way, they are usually referred to as a school of poets, the metaphysical school of poetry. For example, brings together such uh, poets as Donne, Falk, Herbert, and Marvell. The Romantic school of poetry links Wordsworth and Coleridge to Shelley and Keats, and so forth. In the history of English poetry, curtain-proven forms and curtain-proven subjects have endured. When a certain kind of poetry ceases to be entertaining to the readers of an era, it dies and awaits a revival which sometimes of course never comes. And then we have uh, the limits of analysis. There is virtual no limitation placed on the analysis of poetry. One can go quite far when trying to arrive at the meaning of poem. One reaches a point where one cannot find evidence for proving what the poet meant when he wrote certain lines. One then has to be resourceful to use the imagination And in particular, to search for the less obvious yet possible meaning and other. Often the bizarre leads to the correct, just as one very first ideas about a poem are often the most significant and profound. Interpreting a poem is sometimes a matter of intuition, making the difference between cut and dry explication and imaginative interpretation. All guesswork or playing hunches, the good reader asks more of himself, or playing bunches, the good reader asks more of himself, or at least as much of himself as he asks of the point. When T.S. Eliot or Shakespeare wrote enigmatic lines of poetry, they quite explicitly hope to awaken our curiosity and arouse us into creative thought. And then we have the many types of poetry. We should understand. At the outset that poetry can be written for different reasons, and therefore each poem has a different purpose. Some poems are written purely to entertain us, others solely for the purpose of moral persuasion. We are argued perhaps to right action or perhaps to wrong action. We are tempted or told to resist temptation. Many poems try to be both entertaining and instructive, both amusing and edifying at the same time. Whenever we analyze a poem, we must consider as best we can the purpose the poet had in writing it. So that's all for me. And then we have Isanul Ikram. Thank you.
Okay, then the next material is point of view in poetry. If we were to prize a poem without explaining that we were doing so in spite the author's failure to accomplish what he had outlined for himself, it will be assumed that we were misreading the poem or perhaps missing the point. At every step in a poetic analysis, we must be sure that we are letting our reader know precisely what we are discussing and why. That's about the point of view. The next is the critic in a poetry. This is discussing about judging a poem for the right reason leads us to consider momentarily what we mean by critic. So critic in a short is being a creative and thorough reader. One reads carefully, ferreting out meaning, surveying and understanding the basic design or form of the poem, and then writes down all of his collected information in a legit and helpful fashion. And in other words, the critic is who is willing to make some comment on poetry. That is about the critic in a poetry. Okay, the next material is two level of meaning. First, the literal, and second one is the symbolic. When we analyzing a poetry, we must always remember the basic twofold approach of all of our reading of poetry. We must understand both the literal sense of the poem and the symbolic or suggest meaning of the poem. It is further important to understand the nature of relationship between the different levels of a poem's meaning. So there is two levels of meaning. And next is the variety of the reader response, because the reader of poems always have different interpret and always have different comments and critique. And in this book is written, no poem is ever completed. By this we mean that the poet always leaves some word for his reader. And no one of us who criticizes poetry can be all wrong. True, we may wander too far from the intention of the poem. As long as we make some response, we are functioning as critics. Being critics entails making some sort of judgment about the value and purpose of words of the literature. One reader judgment may cause another reader to express dissent, and this is usually desirable. And also, is if descent, in other words, often leads to discovery. Descent often leads to discovery. That's make better the reader response, make a different interpret, make a new discovery.
The opportunity to continue the slide. Okay, now about grasping the central image. When we analyze anything, we always begin by separating it into the component parts. This done, we try to examine each of the parts first separately, then relationship to each other, and finally in relationship to the whole. Next, about discovering the point in the poem. One reason we undertake the analysis of poetry is to discover what is characteristic of the particular poem. Usually, as we labor toward what is characteristic, we need to make trial hypothesis, find exception, then move on the new hypothesis. Next, about poetry and life. To become appreciative readers, it is necessary that we work for both concerted and subtle analysis of the poems we read. If we make no effort to understand in various ways, we cannot consider ourselves good readers. And the last is about poetry as art. In direction our attention to problem of the responding correctly to the poem meaning, we perhaps have neglected to question of responding to its art. It is not as easy to respond to art as one might think, but we must confront the art of writing poetry as an art. Okay, back to Isanul Ikram. Thank you.
Alright, thank you very much for watching our video, and forgive us if we have some mistake in our video, in our word. So thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.